Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Kahn.
And I'm Talli Rosenbaum. Our topic for today, even though we have discussed this in the past, is going to be chronic wartime stress. And I think we're going to talk about chronic stress and its effect on relationships, specifically intimate relationships, because that's what we're all about. But I also want to discuss how chronic ongoing stress, uncertainty, especially here in Israel, but also throughout the diaspora as well, when it comes to the Jewish people, have affected relationships, specifically intimate relationships, but all relationships.
As you mentioned, Talli, we did talk about this in episode 51, which was released just a few weeks after October 7th. And even though we're revisiting that topic, I think it's actually quite different. The difference between the immediate shock of a wartime kind of stress versus an ongoing, continued type of stress. And as you said, we're not only talking about war. There are so many stresses that people across the world, and I'll say the Jewish people in particular, are experiencing now, whether it's the ongoing and erupting anti-Semitism, whether it's stresses of wartime in Israel or the constant need to go to reserve duty for soldiers and their wives. There's so many stresses that people are dealing with right now. It's important to talk about it, not just in the acute sense of the shock of a surprise attack, which we experienced on October 7th, but 2.5+ years of this ongoing stress.
Exactly. I think that this is a unique situation, even though there are many populations and there have been many studies about the impact of chronic stress. But our situation is unique in that we've talked about this as something that was an event. October 7th was an event, traumatic day in history. And when we're in a trauma, like 9/11, for example, we're supposed to respond this way. We're hypervigilant. We're in survival mode. When the source of the trauma has passed and we're safe again, it's no longer adaptive to be in that mode. We're supposed to go back to normal. And what happened to us is that we've never really quite been able to go back to normal. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
I'll just make one final point, which is that I'm still embarrassed on some level about my attitudes immediately after October 7th. I remember you and I recorded an Orthodox Conundrum episode together, and I talked about how there's before and there's after, and now we're after this terrible traumatic event. And you're the one who pointed out that we're very much not after. And looking back, I see how silly I was, how naive I was, I suppose, looking back and thinking that the big event had happened and now we're kind of going to have to deal with that event. And that was simply not true. The stress had only begun. And thinking about it now, looking back, I certainly hope that we're on the other side. But realizing now what we know, there's so much stress that's ongoing. And I think that can relate to everybody, whether living in Israel or outside of Israel. We'll get to that conversation in just a moment. First, remember to check out intimatejudaism.com for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review, and leave a comment. And make sure to check out the Intimate Judaism community on Facebook, which is a safe space where you can discuss intimacy and healthy sexuality in the context of Jewish family life. And Talli, we've talked about this over and over, but I'm pleased to say it's finally happening. Intimacy and Sexuality for Emerging Adults is going to drop very, very soon.
Yay.
Look for details on the Intimate Judaism community on Facebook.
It's really happening.
It's about time.
Yes.
So as a way of introduction, I'm actually going to say something which I already said in that episode 51 over 2.5 years ago, but I'm going to take it in a different direction, which I think is more relevant to today. Back then I mentioned something which appears in Parshat Noach. In Parshat Noach, the verse reads that Noach and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives came with him into the ark. And Rashi comments there that the reason this says Noach and his sons, and then says and his wife and his daughters-in-law went into the ark, is to demonstrate that the men went in separately from the women, because while the world is experiencing agony, they are not allowed to have intimate relations, and therefore they came in separately. And in contrast, when they left the ark, the pasuk says, God told Noah, leave the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and their wives with you. Which means that, as Rashi points out, at this point, they were allowed halachically to have intimate relations again. So the first point I want to make, which I did make last time, is this. Halakha dictates the norms we need to keep and the actions we need to do and the emotions we need to feel inside. And halakha is often giving an externalization of what we're likely feeling inside, Or alternatively, it can help us internalize the way we should feel if we don't feel that way. So for example, another good example of the same idea is that when someone's sitting Shiva after a loved one has died, that person is not allowed to have sex. Intimacy is forbidden during the week of Shiva. Now, on the one hand, it could be an externalization, an expression of how he's feeling inside, or it could be seen the other way. If he isn't necessarily feeling that grief yet, the fact that he has these restrictions, such as not having sex, can help him internalize that idea too. Rav Soloveitchik expressed this idea very interestingly, showing how the way we act in halakha can externalize what we're already feeling. When he said on Tisha B'Av, you're not allowed to eat, he goes, right, who can eat? He already was feeling that inside. For many of us who are not on that madrega, who are not in that level of spiritual awareness, not eating on Tisha B'Av perhaps can teach us, this is how I should feel. I should feel like I can't eat, even if I don't naturally feel that way, because I'm in such mourning. But what I want to mention now is something else which I didn't talk about in episode 51, which is that I just mentioned now the commandment from God to Noah saying, you can go out and you're allowed to have intimate relations again, because it says that Noah and his wife were allowed to go out together. However, when it actually describes how they went out, after that command, it reads, Noah went out with his sons and his wife and his daughters-in-law with him. In other words, even though at this point they were allowed to be together, they went out separately, the same way they went in. When they went in the ark, they were prohibited from being intimate. Now that they go out, they were allowed to be intimate, but they still weren't. Now, this is simply what the pasuk says. Hashem says you can go out together, and yet they went out separately. The animals, it says, however, went out together. It says, Lamishpachotehem, according to their families. And I think this demonstrates something very, very profound about the difference between the way human beings react to stress after the stress may be over, or while the initial shock is over, but the stress continues, versus animals. When the animals went out, they were fine. They could go out in their families, it says. Noah was allowed to also, but they still couldn't do it. Maybe this is, to put it in very modern terms, almost like a PTSD. Even though he and his sons were allowed to be together with their wives, they didn't want to. And the idea of ongoing stress, I believe, is at least hinted at in this particular pasuk. I wanted just to throw that out sort of as an opening thought, and perhaps you have something to say about that as well, Talli, before we get into our questions.
It's very interesting, the response to being almost existentially erased. We know that throughout our history, and we have Holocaust literature as well. And I think that it kind of relates to this question of why would we be talking about intimacy and why would we be talking about sexuality in the midst of this tremendous trauma and threat to our existential being. And I think that you kind of touched on it with the idea of reconnection after the trauma has passed. How do we do that? And one answer to that is that in the midst of shock and sadness and loss, when we're kind of least able to even think about intimacy, it's adaptively not where we need to be when we're trying to protect ourselves. We do actually seek connection. We seek connection in the face of death. We see this with cancer patients. We see this when we want to affirm that we're alive. And for the Jewish people, it's procreation, it's recreation, it's a future, it's building families. Certainly after the Holocaust, people built very, very big families. And so I think it's really about the affirmation of our existence. It's part of our resilience. There are some interesting quotes if you look at the Holocaust literature about how people connected. Elie Wiesel in Night talks about a young woman and a boy who traveled in a wagon, and they hugged and they kissed each other, trying to keep their distance from other people. And also in Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, he talks about the salvation of man is through love. In this world, the only thing left for us is the bliss of contemplating one's beloved. And so we know that this idea of holding on to connection, it's an anchor, and it's how we help people in the immediate aftermath of trauma. It's not by doing any kind of deep therapy techniques. It's by connecting. It's by getting them a glass of water. It's by listening to what they need to tell, not pulling their story out of them, but just connecting to their immediate need.
All right, Talli, let's get into some specific questions I want to ask you about your experience as a clinician in dealing with some of this. Because since that initial day of October 7th, many people have spoken about feeling like different people than they were before. How can trauma and prolonged crisis affect our identity, the way we see the world, and our foundational beliefs?
Well, how can they affect them? They do affect them. Trauma essentially changes us. We're not the same people who we were before. And this does affect our relationships when our identities change. We've taken on new identities. There are the Nova survivors, the bereaved families, the hostage families, the hostages, the returned hostages, the widows, the young widows, the mothers of soldiers who were killed, the fathers, the families, reservists, Miluim wives and husbands, volunteers. We have all kinds of new identities. The list goes on. And also, people have questioned their beliefs. People who were more on the left have become more on the right. People who were more on the right may have become more on the left. So our politics change. Religious feelings and beliefs may have changed. Ideology, faith, observance. And so all of this is part of what gets created in the aftermath of trauma. And of course, it can affect the relationships that you're in. You're not the same person that you were with before. Trauma isn't only about fear or anxiety. It fundamentally affects our identity, our values, our beliefs about the world, and the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are.
Well, in what way could they affect external relationships? How does that manifest, for example?
Well, let's look at this in the context of what we've experienced, at least here in Israel, but I think that there's a ripple effect throughout the world. We see some rupture. In the beginning, everybody was biyachad ninatzeach, we will get through this together. And there was a real feeling of unity. We're going to be there for one another. That seems to me to be a very adaptive trauma response for the moment. When that kind of calmed down, what we're seeing is ruptures, and not only between couples, but also families, friendships, communities, if we go to the outer layers. And not because people don't care about one another or have changed their feelings towards one another, but because certain words or concepts have become highly charged.
What do you mean?
Well, words like settler violence or occupation, they feel like deep moral accusations. And for other people, statements like there are no innocent civilians or we have to flatten Gaza, that can feel equally threatening. So these statements are not experienced as opinions, they're experienced as attacks on values, our identity, on moral reality. Some relative from America can say, why are you guys genociding? And you can feel very personally reactive and attacked and defensive by that. So when that happens, relationships can become strained.
And I actually want to expand this a little bit because it's not only regarding issues with Israel and claims of genocide and all the other things that we hear, which can cause tremendous pain and tremendous agony. Just in general, the polarization that has taken place, I would say, especially over the past decade, but going back even further, between different political camps. When we were younger, Talli, I think that people who were Republicans or Democrats, for example, in the United States, they would strongly disagree, but they didn't look at the other side as being fundamentally and foundationally evil. And today, I'm not saying everyone thinks that, but that is a much more common approach than it was in the past, where if someone voted for this candidate as opposed to that candidate, it's not simply that I disagree with you, but you are doing something morally offensive. And that can really draw people apart, I think.
Absolutely. There is a lot less nuance today regarding political beliefs, religious beliefs. Things have become more polarized and black and white. And if you're already in a relationship, if you're in a family relationship, that can cause strain. If you're in an intimate relationship and you have taken on less nuanced views, that can create conflict between a couple. But even if you're dating, you're going to have difficulty finding somebody if you are dead set on that person seeing the world the same way that you do.
That's something which can affect singles in a very serious way, making sure that you find someone who's not only compatible, but in the same political camp. But what about a married couple that finds themselves on opposite ends of these moral arguments? I think of James Carville and Mary Madeline. James Carville was one of the main campaign advisors for Bill Clinton, and Mary Madeline was one of the main advisors for George Bush. And it was very well known they got married, even though they were on opposite sides of the 1992 presidential campaign in the United States. And I don't want to talk about the internal politics or anything else, but to me, it's almost symbolic that they were on opposite sides and they got married and they say, we just don't talk about politics. On the other hand, another example, which is much more modern, is someone named Kellyanne Conway, who was one of President Trump's closest advisors. her husband, who's also a Republican, someone named George Conway, who became anti-Trump while remaining a conservative Republican, but he became anti-Trump, and they got divorced. Let me please clarify, in case anyone thinks I'm saying that I know why Kellyanne Conway and George Conway got divorced. Of course not. I have absolutely no idea. I'm using it as a symbol, nothing more, nothing less. To me, it's almost emblematic of the difference, the way things were. Once upon a time, these differences mattered, but didn't necessarily affect your family life. And today, they matter so much that they can't do anything but affect family life.
They do. And we have to recognize that couples that are able to contain wide differences in opinion, whether it's religious or political, are generally couples that are better differentiated. When I talk about differentiation, and I believe the concept has come up before, it's that within a relationship, we don't take each other's opinions or beliefs personally. And we allow space for recognizing that we are two different people and we can still love one another and be committed to one another, even if we don't necessarily agree on everything. I think that the difficulties come in when there are actual decisions that need to be made around these differences. So in the aftermath of October 7th and in the almost 3 years since, I've had couples coming in with major differences. Some of the common ones have been, do we stay or do we go?
Meaning leaving the country.
Leaving the country because they have small kids. These wars have been really hard. Not everybody has family here that they can go to that have a mamad. You know, our kids come home. If they don't have a mamad, they can come to us and
Come
be
to our
with
houses,
us.
right?
But there are couples here that their parents are living abroad, and it's really, really hard to deal with this war. So one partner may want to stay, the other may want to go. I'm thinking about a Hasidic couple. I had been working with them. This was not a new couple, but on one occasion, the husband came in and said, listen, I want to join the army. And this became a real conflict. His wife was like, you want to ruin our lives and our children's lives and our children's ability to stay in their frameworks educationally and their ability to have partners be, I guess, shidduched over to them or whatever. Like there are so many implications for that. But, you know, that was a good opportunity to talk about.
I like that phrase, shidduched over to them.
Shidduched over. Yeah. I didn't want to say given to them, or I wanted to be more ret, I think is the word, ret to them. So, yeah, I think that being really aware of conflicts and how to manage those conflicts, that's all part of the dealing with the ongoing uncertainty. You can't even plan a vacation. What if we get stuck? What if we get stuck out of the country in some place and we can't get back, or we have to go through Egypt or Jordan? It's really, really a lot of very stressful feelings for Jews outside of Israel as well as inside of Israel, for sure inside, but it does have a ripple effect.
But I want to take that in a different direction, because now we've been talking about when the couples are disagreeing because they have different opinions. Should we stay? Should we go? Should we vote for this candidate or that candidate? But there's something else which I think has a direct line to stress and trauma, which is that even if it's not a difference of opinion, it's a more primal difference in reaction to stress.
Absolutely. And I do want to talk about that. I want to step back a moment because we were talking before we got on about how we were going to address the ripple effect. So I think it is important to talk about the whole idea of the hierarchy of trauma, in the sense that we have the first tier whose homes were invaded, whose family members were killed right in front of them. And we have the Nova survivors who went through horrible, horrible things, and the hostages and the families of the hostages. There's the direct witnesses of trauma. And then there's the outer layers, family members, people you knew. And then I don't know anybody who was killed. And I think that the Jewish people outside of Israel feel like they are, unless, God forbid, they have a child who something happened to them in Israel, they feel like they're on the outer layer. There's a psychologist and researcher named Mayrav Roth, and she wrote about the fourth circle, people who are not directly harmed and may not even know someone personally who died, but they still live inside with this ongoing reality. There's often a great deal of survivor's guilt. People who survived horrors, they'll say, well, why am I still alive? And they're living with that. And the question becomes, how is it okay for me to be okay when other people are not okay? And these feelings do affect relationships. They can make it harder to allow oneself pleasure or closeness. And it can lead to withdrawal, or it could lead to tension. And this exactly relates to the question that you asked, when one partner wants to engage and the other wants to hold back. So you were asking about what happens when partners respond differently, and why partners respond differently have to do with a lot of different factors.
Let me just add one point to that, Talli, before you
Yeah,
go on. Not
sure.
only do they respond differently, but they also can sometimes, I believe, morally judge the other partner for not reacting correctly. That can sometimes happen, I think, too. For example, if one partner wants to talk about what happened and the other one doesn't want to talk about it, the first partner might say, "Why don't you care?" Whereas it's not a
Right,
matter of not
exactly.
caring, it's a matter of simply a different way
Avoidance.
of adapting to it.
Exactly. And that is important for couples to understand. And that's part of the kind of psychoeducational interventions that are being done in order to explain to couples that do not take your partner's response personally. Because, yes, one partner may want to avoid, the other partner may want to talk. One partner may want to always be intimate, always seek connection, always try to be together, and the other partner may need to distance in order to self soothe. So we certainly see these disparities in Miluim couples.
Miluim meaning reservists.
Yes, reservist soldiers. And we're talking about reservists specifically because they generally have families, they have children, a wife at home, and the wife at home is dealing with the home front, often working full time, taking care of the kids' needs, dealing with crises, and doing it, holding it all alone. The husband, usually it's the husband, sometimes women do miluim and it's reversed, or they're both doing miluim, and I don't know how they're handling that. They must have to have supportive family. But we're in a situation where there are so many ripples of relationships because, first of all, the Miluim wife in October of 2023 was used to having help. The single sister would come and help her every time. But by the third or fourth or fifth or sixth round of Miluim, the single sister is maybe no longer single, or she's in university now. She can't help anymore. Like our sources, our resources have kind of run out. How much can you ask your mother or mother-in-law to come? Like your mother and mother-in-law may also not be retired yet, may be taking care of an older parent, may be going through a difficult marriage themselves.
Or
Like
they
they're
may have other kids who also have spouses in Miluim.
exactly. So there is this kind of limitation of resources. You don't have ongoing resources for helping, for connecting, for support. And meanwhile, you've got the couple. So, as I said, the woman's been carrying, generally speaking, it's the woman carrying everything at home. The husband comes back from, let's say he's been in combat. And this is still going on today because we still have Miluim soldiers in combat up north. There's still some low level stuff happening in Gaza. It's happening. And you have a man who is also a brother and also a father and also a son and also a husband, and his life is in danger day to day. We are still experiencing this on a daily basis. But anyway, he comes home. And to be a soldier, you have to be hyper focused. You have to be hyper vigilant. You have to not think about the kind of things that you think about when you're at home. When you're at home, you think about, is there food? Is there drink? Time to put the kids to bed. And it is a very, very different reality than the fight or flight survival reality of the battlefront. So they come home. And what happens is that they don't meet, not that they don't want to meet, and not that they don't love each other and want to reconnect, but there are so many factors. Even now, almost 3 years later, there are so many factors that make it difficult for Miluim couples to reconnect. There's the idea that you have no idea what I've been through. Intimacy, certainly for the soldiers, can be channeled towards their army buddies because only their army buddies have the language that they can speak together, that they really get what's going on there in their life. So you're leading two very different lives. And the wife at home may be saying, you have no idea what it's been like here. You are so disconnected from the reality. You don't even know that I had to go to Terem, that's the emergency services, because our 4-year-old cut his finger. I didn't even tell you that. I didn't even want to bother you to tell you that I had to get somebody to come. And so there's this kind of quiet competition over who's had it worse. And there's also what you said, the different responses. We're wired differently in our nervous systems. We've talked about attachment styles many times on our podcast. So some may be wired in a more anxious style where they need to seek connection in order to calm down. And the partner may be wired in a more avoidant style where they need to soothe on their own in order to calm down. And so sometimes it makes it very difficult to connect.
And I would guess that it can even turn into a type of cycle. For example, let's say a Miluim wife is complaining to her husband that you have no idea what's been going on over here. You don't know how hard it's been. And then she thinks to herself, my husband's been under fire. People have been trying to kill him. And I'm complaining about my kid, my 4-year-old's cut finger and needing to go to Terem at 2 a.m. And that can lead to a sense of guilt. I'm being unfair, which can in turn lead to resentment because that's the response to that feeling of guilt. And I assume if it's not taken care of, it can cycle into a very bad place.
And these are things that are very important to communicate about, to find the time to be able to really sit down and talk. The Army also recognizes the need for Miluim couples to get some help and partially pays for couples therapy. Maybe what we'll do is look for some resources that we can add to the show notes. Even if you don't see yourself as a couple that would necessarily need couples therapy, you're a good couple, you love each other, you don't generally have conflicts. I think we're looking at external variables that make it very, very hard for couples. Even if you have all the resources, you communicate well, you might not need therapy, but if you could take advantage of the various programs that are out there for Miluim couples, or use your Miluim credits to go on that vacation, to go to a resort hotel, really take advantage of the opportunities to reconnect in order to be able to heal and rewind a bit.
So I'd like to widen the lens just a little bit and talk about couples who are not necessarily in Israel, couples who are Jewish, but who are experiencing all sorts of stresses that people are experiencing across the world. For example, the resurgent anti-Semitism, or for example, the constant need to be vigilant about Israel, even outside of Israel, when you're being told by everybody around you how terrible Israel is, and you take this as a personal affront, as perhaps you should, and you feel the sense of everything you ever believed is falling apart. Now, you may do this together with your partner. This might be something which you're experiencing together, but it wouldn't surprise me that even if it's not a case where the wife has been home and the husband's been in Miluim, you're actually doing this together, you're still responding to it in completely different ways. And the stresses you're dealing with are very internal and very personal. I'm sure that has an effect on their intimate lives as well. Am I right?
It absolutely can. I don't think that we have any research on this, at least not at the moment. I think that anti-Semitism, fear is one of the variables of what can create anxiety and chronic tension and stress. And so when you respond to stressors, let's say in a hypervigilant way, in a catastrophizing way, and your partner is the opposite, is hyper rational and says, well, demonstrate to me that this is really an issue, then you're not meeting. We want to meet somewhere in the middle. We call the wise mind, where we can acknowledge that there indeed are stressors and life is more uncertain than it has been in the past. Anti-Semitism does exist. But on the other hand, do we need to catastrophize? To what extent do we need to live our lives allowing fear to create a reality where we can't relax? And if we can't relax, we can't connect. And if we can't connect, we can't be intimate. And if we can't be intimate, we can't connect. So that really is what we want to talk about, even though it's taken us a while to get there. But this is intimate Judaism, and we do talk about intimate partners and sexuality. And again, I want to shout out with acknowledgement to singles. It's been very difficult to create intimacy and to date for the same reasons that the Miluim couples and their wives don't meet together or have difficulty, because there's a lot of interruptions and they're back and forth. Think about the Miluim soldier who's trying to date, and think about the young women who are trying to date and they don't exactly know how to even acknowledge the relationship. Their dating partner goes away to war and they don't even know, what am I going to be to him if he comes back injured or if he doesn't come back at all? I mean, these are real existential concerns. What if he comes back without a leg? Do I still want to be his girlfriend? There's so many things that we think about. And even with matchmaking, I have heard this and I've seen this, that people are being matched in accordance to their levels of trauma. This person lost brother, and I'm going to put them with that person because they know what it's like. They lost an uncle or something crazy like that, where your level of exposure to trauma creates this almost box that you tick in the shidduch list of things about you.
Well, do you think that's a good thing or you think that's a problem?
I think it's an interesting observation, and I don't necessarily know whether it lands as a good thing or not. I think that it really depends on the couple.
So, Talli, now that you mentioned intimacy, I know that you are a clinician, but you've also been involved in some serious research about how couples deal with trauma and stress and how it affects intimacy. So I'm curious what you've discovered over the past few years since the beginning of this war and now. What's changed? What research has shown about how couples deal with this and how it has affected their sex lives?
So let's first talk about the effect of trauma on emotional intimacy. So what we know from many years of research, including the work of Professor Zahava Solomon and her team, is that trauma doesn't just stay in the individual. It enters the relationship and it affects how people communicate, how close they feel to each other, and how safe it is to be vulnerable with each other. And this is because trauma dysregulates. People with post-traumatic stress disorder could go into fits of anger and doesn't feel like you're with a safe partner. In fact, Dr. Solomon's research, they did research on Yom Kippur War veterans, and they found that PTSD symptoms developed in their partners over time.
And what about sexuality?
That's a great question because people didn't talk about sexuality then. I was involved in some research together with my sister, Rachel Yehuda, and her colleagues, and we looked at the neurophysiology of stress and post-traumatic stress disorder, and we compared it to the neurophysiology of sexual arousal. And what we found is that sexual arousal mirrors the reality of the stress response. So when you don't have post-traumatic stress disorder and you're about to engage in sexual activity, your heart rate goes higher, your blood flows, you can feel yourself getting excited, but it doesn't scare you because you know that you're going for a ride and it's just sex and you're going to be okay. What we found is that in people with PTSD, especially combat veterans, when they experience a physiological reality that mirrors the stress response, it can trigger flashbacks, it can trigger fear, it can make the sexual experience overwhelming, and then they will need to shut down or avoid it or not be able to tolerate it. And we found this to be kind of an independent risk factor for sexual dysfunction in people with PTSD. But that was PTSD. And we were not yet talking about PTSD when we did some research here in Israel on what is known as acute stress disorder. Now, acute stress disorder is a misnomer. It's not a disorder. When we're in acute stress, all of these reactions are normal. But when I say we, I'm talking about Professor Ataret Gewurtz and Professor Aryeh Lazar. And we got together, the three of us, and we started studying individuals and couples and their sexuality in the aftermath of October 7th. And we found some interesting things. I'll just briefly say this. We looked at media exposure and direct exposure to the traumatic events and the symptoms of acute stress, wanting to understand how they affected sexuality. And what we found that was very interesting was that sexual distress, which was one of the variables that we looked at, was very closely associated to increased media consumption. So people who were watching graphic videos all the time, following the news all the time, they were more likely to endorse having sexual distress. So that's an important take home because it makes us understand that looking at the media all the time keeps you in a constant state of hypervigilance and how it's important to disconnect and not constantly be watching the news and seeing the sites because that just overexposes you and doesn't allow you to feel safe. We also looked at sexual frequency and we looked at the different reasons that people who were having less sex were having less sex. We definitely predicted that people would be having less sex, but interestingly, of our sample, which was only really 1,200 people, only 50% of the people said that they were having less sex. Many people said they were having the same amount of sex, and a very small percentage said they were having even more, although that was not necessarily partnered sex. Just want to put it out there. That might have been masturbation or pornography, which tends to soothe people when they're under stress. So what we really found was a great deal of variability. We found some interesting things. One interesting thing that we found was that people cited both emotional reasons, and I've seen this clinically. How can I have sex when people are suffering, when there are hostages in the tunnels of Gaza? I keep getting these images in my head. This is something I've also heard from, by the way, people in the US and outside of Israel and the UK and other countries saying that after October 7th, they could not have sex. They would either burst into tears or they would have images in their mind. So it did affect, in the beginning, a lot of people emotionally. They weren't able to connect sexually. And what we also found was, in addition to emotional reasons, there were practical reasons. There can be sirens. We were evacuated to a hotel room with our children, so we can never get together. There's so many practical reasons that also don't allow for intimacy to occur. Again, these studies were conducted very early. We started collecting data at the end of October, and the studies came out, and my colleagues are still continuing to study long-term effects. And that's really interesting, to study long-term effects on couples of chronic wartime, ongoing uncertainty.
You said so much that's so interesting over here. Even at the very, very beginning, the first fact that you pointed out, the acute stress disorder is not a disorder. And you've pointed out before
Well,
that
that's my opinion.
I recognize what you mean. You said it's actually the
The
way you're
DSM
supposed to
might
react.
disagree. I don't know. That's my opinion.
It's only a disorder in the fact that you don't want to have acute stress. But once you have acute stress, this is normal. And even the fact you often say the PTSD, people say, oh, I have PTSD. And you say, no, it's not post. You're in the middle of the trauma right now. And people often just use that
Also,
shorthand.
not everybody has PTSD. Right. It's really, really important. Sometimes we look at the headlines and we look at articles and we say, there's a plague of PTSD and everybody has PTSD. Not everybody has PTSD. And also, it's not binary. So we are all wired differently. It doesn't mean we have PTSD. Every time I hear a motorcycle rev up, it sounds like a siren and my nervous system activates. I can feel it, even though I know. Okay, on Yom HaZikaron, I knew there was going to be a siren at 11 in the morning. I was waiting for it, and when it started, I still had that quick jump. So we are wired differently, and to some extent, we all carry symptoms of stress, but that does not mean that we all suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. That's very important to point out.
Let me ask you about something which you mentioned just in passing. You said there was a very small percentage of people who actually had a greater frequency of sex as a result, or I don't know if as a result, but after the stressful or during the stressful event. Is that something which we can learn from? Is there something that can be explained?
It's hard to learn from the study because the study also showed, again, that people endorsed increased frequency of sex, even though they were referring to masturbation. And that's not partnered sex. Partnered sex is a very, very different experience. Partnered sex requires the ability to be present, the ability to be relaxed, the ability to have real intimacy, to make sure that your partner is enjoying themselves. And that might be way too much. Certainly, we know that that can be overwhelming. And so some people with stress responses will turn to pornography, not because they want necessarily sex or intimacy. It's because they want to calm down or they want to numb out. So it's also very useful in the context of couples therapy, because you can have somebody who comes into couples therapy and says, my husband's a porn addict. I found all this porn on his computer, even though he doesn't want to have sex with me. And in addition to your very, very legitimate feelings of betrayal, let's understand also what it is for him. Often it's not about wanting to betray, but it's about wanting to calm down, maybe even to be able to be with, it's just overwhelming, the partnered intimacy. So what we can also learn from that is that there are many different responses in terms of intimacy, where some couples will seek more, some couples will seek less. Most of the time there's variability within couples, so that can create some conflict. As I said before on this podcast, we often see anxiously attached people married to more avoidantly attached people. And so that already is a template of conflict. So these are things that we can all look at. I don't think anything really tells us something definitive.
I mean, I don't know if this is true, but at least according to the way it was often portrayed, immediately after the Gulf War, or 9 months, I should say, after the Gulf War in 1991, there was apparently a baby boom in Israeli hospitals because for a month and a half, people were spending all their time alone with their spouses. They couldn't really go to work or go to school. And everyone says, oh, so that was the time the couples actually became more intimate. Now, that's a very, very different situation because famously during that war where Israel was not really involved, it was being bombed by Iraq, but was not responding. It was a war with the allies, the United States and its allies, and Israel was asked to stand on the side. And ultimately, despite the original fears of what might be, there were no chemical weapons on those Scud missiles. There were 39 Scud missiles and relatively few deaths that actually resulted directly from those missiles. At the same time, it is interesting that that stressful situation did not lead, if the rumors are true, that stressful situation did not lead to the same reluctance to have sex that seems to be much more common now.
Yeah, there's no question that the war has impacted couples and families and communities in so many ways. So there have been children being born. There have been marriages, and there have been remarriages of widows and of widowers. There have been ruptures, though, and also losses and divorces and couples who have moved away from each other rather than towards each other. But, we have relational resilience in our country, and we're left with a kind of paradox, really. We need connection in order to heal. But at the same time, when we're under ongoing chronic stress, it's often very hard to have access to that vulnerability, to that letting go that we have to have in order to connect.
All right, Talli, we've talked a lot about what the problems are, and we've also alluded to or mentioned some of the answers or some of the solutions or some of the responses in passing. But I'd like to deal with that directly and practically right now. If a couple is experiencing reduced intimacy and it bothers them, because if it doesn't bother them, I assume that's probably okay, if they're both okay with living with reduced intimacy. But if it is something which they see as a problem, and it is a result of everything that's been happening in terms of the stress in their lives, the stress in the world, what should they do? What do you think is a good thing to do, apart from simply having a conversation, which you already mentioned? And let me just add to that question, part of the issue and part of the difficulty is that the reasons for whether it's sexual dysfunction or reduced intimacy can be different things. It could be a physiological issue, it could be a mental issue, and sometimes it's hard to know what it is that is actually causing the problem. The symptom might be having less sex, but that's not necessarily the cause. So how would you address that if a couple came to you and said, we want to deal with this?
I think this is a great question because it also speaks to the depth that's required to unpack what is happening with a couple that's experiencing difficulties in their sexual life. And it has so many layers. So some people might say, okay, why open everything up? Maybe it's just a matter of something physiological and hormones and something that is technical and something that is functional. And we can start with that. And that very well may be the case, and being able to focus directly on what might be happening in the bedroom in terms of the assumption being that they both are interested and want it, but it's not working, you can always go in that direction. My experience and the work that I do is far more wide in terms of looking at all the different factors that contribute to whether couples do engage in intimacy, want to engage in intimacy, and the kind of sexual life that they have and the kind of sexual satisfaction that they have. If we zoom out and look at couples with the war, why is it that some couples are okay and their sex lives and intimate lives are okay and others are having so many issues? Well, that might have to do with predictors. So, for example, we could say that we can predict that couples who prioritized sexuality, had good communication around sexuality, were able to talk about things and not take things personally when one partner wasn't in the mood, it's likely that they're going to be able to get through this crisis with less difficulty than couples that already had some power struggles and some discrepancies in desire and some issues around their relationship to begin with. So if we're looking at where would we start, it's really hard to know because it's hard to know what it sits on primarily and what are the other factors that contribute to it. Sexual problems can be perpetuated by issues in the relationship and stressors and physiological issues. We've talked about this many times before. And so we really want to get an understanding of what's going on here, what's going on in the relationship, what's going on individually. Again, if we're looking at bringing in this additional factor of war, and if we're looking, let's say, at soldiers, there's depression, there's anxiety, there's things that haven't been talked about. Sometimes there are injuries, sometimes there's moral injury. And moral injury is distinctly different from PTSD. It's not the same, it's not just a symptom of PTSD. Moral injury is when you are carrying around the burden of having to see or engage in things that go against what you morally believe to be okay. And terrible things have happened that people can't even talk about, but they're carrying this around within them. And so to be able to find the right support, whether it's therapy, whether it's groups, there are resources for soldiers, thank God, and they do need to be accessed. And it's not a weakness. I think that our toxic masculine culture, if we look maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, men would have felt that it's weak to have post-trauma. Only sissies end up with trauma. And a real man can get on with his life. And that's a message that hopefully has changed, that a real man is also very sensitive and is also very human and certainly would be affected by what he's had to go through.
So, Talli, there's a lot there that you said, which is important yet heavy. So let's end perhaps on a more upbeat note without denying anything that we said until now. But I know there are also occasions for hope, people's capacity for resilience and for healing. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I think that, we know from the experts in trauma that there are pathways to healing. And some of those pathways are to tell your story, to share, to connect. Basically, the opposite of trauma is connection. And to understand that we have a lot of resources. We don't all need to go to therapy. We don't all have PTSD, but we are all somewhat affected. And to recognize that part of our resilience is in our communities, is in our families, is in our friendships, is in our volunteering that we do or that we receive the benefit from, and to be open to receiving resources, to be open to mindfulness and yoga and taking breaks and doing what we need to do, but also what we want to do.
Have you found instances of that where people really are more resilient than one would have expected?
Absolutely. I think that people have even said that they never believed that they would be as resilient as they have been, and that they would be able to come out of this with recognizing what their strengths have been.
Well, Talli, I really appreciate all that you said. There's a lot there to think about. Like so many things that we discussed, this is an opening rather than a closing. It's something which people can then further in their own conversations with their partners.
I also just want to add one thing. You said this is kind of depressing. Let's end up on something positive. And I think that we always tend to want to do that. But sometimes we just need to sit in the feelings, even if they're not what we would call positive feelings. It's okay. It's okay if it's heavy. It's okay if it feels sad. We have to let ourselves feel our range of feelings and not run away from them.
Well, that gets back to what you said before about acute stress disorder, that sometimes that's how you're supposed to feel.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thank you for everything you just said, Talli. Hopefully this is helpful for people. And getting back to something which is more hopeful, we will hopefully be releasing Intimacy and Sexuality for Emerging Adults in the very near future. Look for it on the Intimate Judaism community on Facebook. Join that community so we can continue these conversations, both the conversation that Talli and I had today, as well as others. Go to intimatejudaism.com, and we will see you next time.
Bye.